The barn burned on a Tuesday, which was the same day of the week that Hazel Townsend had buried her husband 2 years prior, and she had long since stopped believing that coincidences were anything other than the universe's cruelest sense of humor. She stood in the yard in her nightgown, her bare feet in the Kansas dirt, watching the flames crawl up the old timber she and her husband Thomas had built together in the autumn of 1879. The horses were out. She had gotten them out first, instinctively, before she had even fully woken from sleep, because a farm woman knows that the animals come before everything else, including herself. She stood with the rope of the 2 mares wrapped around her fist and watched a year's worth of feed and tools and memory curl up into smoke against the black sky. Her neighbor Clem Hatcher arrived sometime around 3 in the morning with a bucket brigade that accomplished nothing except muddying the ground around the ruin. He was a good man, Clem, though not a particularly effective one. He patted her on the shoulder and told her it was a shame, which it was, and told her Thomas would have known what to do, which was not useful, and told her she should come stay with his family until things settled, which she declined with a polite nod that meant no and had always meant no. Hazel Townsend did not stay anywhere she did not intend to stay. She was 31 years old in the spring of 1882, and she had been managing the Townsend property outside of Caldwell, Kansas, entirely on her own for 2 years. The property was not large by the standards of the territory, but it was hers in every way that mattered. 40 acres of decent grazing land, a small vegetable garden she kept with almost religious devotion, a house Thomas had built before they married that was solid and square and without pretension. She sold eggs and butter at the Saturday market in town and ran a small herd of 6 cattle that she managed herself with a border collie named Soot, and a stubbornness that several of the town's men had privately described as remarkable and publicly pretended to admire. She did not miss Thomas every minute of every day, and she had stopped feeling guilty about that. She missed him in the specific ways that grief settles into after 2 years. She missed the weight of another person in the house, the particular sound of his boots on the porch boards, the way he had hummed while he worked without seeming to know he was doing it. She did not miss the loneliness of being married to a man who had loved the land more than he had ever fully understood how to love her. Thomas Townsend had been a decent husband and a harder man than he knew, and she had grieved him honestly without pretending he had been something he was not. What she needed now was a barn. She hired 3 men from town that first week, a carpenter named Gus Whitfield and 2 brothers, Dale and Emmett Crawford, who were strong if not particularly bright. They worked for 4 days and built something that technically qualified as a barn in the same way that a linta technically qualifies as shelter. It listed slightly to the east. The roof had a gap in the southeast corner that became obvious the moment it rained. Hazel had paid them fair wages and thanked them with the flat politeness she reserved for disappointments, and by October the structure had sagged so badly that one of the support beams cracked in the night and took half the wall down with it. She stood in the ruins of the second barn on a gray October morning, with Soot sitting at her feet and her arms crossed over her chest, and she thought very calmly about what came next. What came next was a second round of hiring, this time a proper construction man named Harvey Prout, who had come down from Wichita with references and a confidence that bordered on theatrical. He was expensive, and she paid him because she had no choice, using the last of what Thomas had left in the bank and part of the egg money she had been saving. Harvey Prout built her a fine-looking barn with good timber and a real hayloft, and a weather vane in the shape of a rooster that caught the light on sunny mornings. It stood for 8 months. A tornado touched down in June of 1883 and removed it from the property with a thoroughness that she could only describe as complete. Not damaged. Gone. The weather vane was found half a mile east in old Bess Calloway's field, and Bess sent it back to Hazel with a note that said she was sorry for her trouble, which was a kind thing to do. The neighbors in town had opinions about this. She heard them in the way that women hear things in small frontier towns, which is to say not directly but in the particular silence that falls when you walk into a room, in the too warm smiles of the women at market, in the way Reverend Doyle had taken to including in his Sunday sermon certain passages about God testing the faithful. Everyone in Caldwell had a theory about Hazel Townsend's barn. Some thought she was cursed. Some thought she was unlucky. Some of the men, and she knew which ones, thought she simply needed a husband to manage things properly. She ignored all of them with a precision she had spent years perfecting. The summer of 1883 passed without a barn. Her cattle sheltered under a rough lean, till she built herself from salvaged timber, and Soot watched her work with an expression that she had always interpreted as respectful concern. She sold 2 of the cattle at the end of summer to keep the finances manageable, and she planted extra in the garden to make up the difference. And she did not ask anyone for help, because asking for help in a way that left you owing something was a transaction she had always been careful about. It was in the early spring of 1884 that she made the decision to build again. She had the lumber ordered from the mill in Wichita, paid in advance, with very specific instructions about the quality of the wood because she had learned, twice now, that bad timber could not be saved by good labor. She had drawn the plans herself over the course of the winter, sitting at the kitchen table by lamplight with Thomas's old surveying papers spread out beside her for reference. She had made the foundation measurements herself. She had set the corner posts herself, driving them into the ground in January when the soil was hard and she could be sure of the placement. By the second week of April the lumber had arrived, stacked neatly near the site, covered with canvas against the rain. She had written ahead to 3 different carpenters and had received 2 replies, neither of which was encouraging. One man wanted more money than she had. The other could not start until July. She was standing at the lumber pile on a Wednesday morning, considering her options with the practical clarity that had become her primary relationship with difficulty, when she heard the sound of hoofbeats coming up the road from town. Arthur Barlow rode a bay horse named Clement, though he only ever called him Clem in a private way that he would have been embarrassed to explain to anyone. He had been in Caldwell for 3 weeks, having come down from Colorado after a stretch of work on the cattle drives that had left him with enough money to consider what he actually wanted to do with himself, which was a question he had been avoiding for 32 years and found himself increasingly unable to ignore. He was not a drifter in the careless sense of the word, though he had drifted. He was a man who had worked every kind of job the frontier offered, from cattle driving to fence post setting to 3 months of mine work in Colorado that he had left after a tunnel collapse that had been the single most frightening experience of his life, including 2 separate occasions in which someone had pointed a gun at him. He had a broad face weathered past its years and dark eyes that paid attention to things, and a way of being quiet that some people mistook for slowness and others, more accurately, read as patience. He had come to Caldwell because a man he had worked with on the drives, a good man named Pete Sorensen, had mentioned that the area was developing and that there might be steady work in construction. Pete had also mentioned, in the particular way that men mention things they want you to understand without saying directly, that the Townsend widow north of town was in need of skilled help and had a reputation for paying fair wages without drama. Arthur had not come looking for a widow specifically. He had come looking for work, and the widow had a job, and that was the full extent of his reasoning as he turned Clement up the road that Wednesday morning. He saw the woman before she saw him, and his first clear thought was that she looked exactly like someone who had no interest in being helped, which he found unexpectedly interesting. Hazel heard the horse and turned, shading her eyes with one hand. She saw a man on a bay horse, broad-shouldered, wearing a plain canvas coat and a hat that had seen considerable use. He did not have the look of a salesman, which was the first useful thing she noted. He stopped the horse at a respectful distance, which was the second. "Morning," he said. "I'm looking for Mrs. Townsend." "You found her," she said. She did not move toward him or away from him, which was her standard greeting for strangers. "Name's Arthur Barlow," he said. "I heard you might be needing a barn built." She looked at him for a moment in the way she had of looking at things, which was thorough and did not pretend to be anything else. "Who told you that?" "Pete Sorensen. I worked the drives with him. He spoke well of you." Pete Sorensen had bought eggs from her for 2 seasons before he moved on, and had always paid without complaint and never tried to make conversation last longer than required, which she considered high praise. The association worked in Arthur's favor. "You're a carpenter?" she asked. "Carpenter builder, decent with stonework," he said. "I've built 3 barns and a schoolhouse and a church that's still standing in Laramie, last I heard." "What have you built that fell down?" He considered the question without taking offense, which she also noted. "A fence in a flood," he said, "and a wall in Colorado that had a foundation problem I should have caught before I started. Both times I went back and made it right at my own cost." She looked at him for another moment. The morning light was clear, and she was a woman who trusted her own eyes. "Get down off your horse," she said. "I'll show you what I have." She walked him through the site with the plans she had drawn herself, which she unrolled on the back of the lumber pile and weighted down with a piece of stone. He looked at them with genuine attention, asked 3 questions about the foundation and 1 about the roof pitch, and did not comment on the fact that a woman had drawn them, which she appreciated without remarking on. "This is solid planning," he said. "You've got the foundation posts right. Most people misplace them by 2 inches and wonder why the frame fights itself." "I measured 3 times," she said. "I can see that." He looked at the lumber. "This is good wood, the grade is right." "It is," she said. "I specified it." He straightened up and looked at the site, then at her, with a directness that was not rude but was not performing anything either. "I can build this," he said. "It'll take me about 3 weeks working steady. I charge fair wages and I don't quit until it's right." "What's fair wages?" she asked, and he told her a number that was reasonable, and she agreed to it without negotiating because it was actually reasonable and she did not negotiate for the sake of it. "I'll need somewhere to sleep," he said. "I have my own bedroll and I'm not asking for hospitality, just whether there's a dry place on the property." She thought about it. There was a small equipment shed at the back of the property that was dry and had enough room. "There's a shed," she said. "It's not comfortable." "I've slept in worse," he said, and she believed him. That was how it began. Arthur Barlow started work on the barn the following Monday morning, arriving in the yard before sunrise with his tools laid out in an order that Hazel, watching from the kitchen window with her coffee, recognized immediately as the order of a man who knew what he was doing. He did not make noise unnecessarily. He did not sing or shout or perform his labor. He simply worked, and the work was good, and it progressed in the steady, measurable way of things done by someone who understands what they are doing and why. She brought him water and food at midday because she brought water and food to anyone working on her property, and because it was practical, and not because she was thinking about him in any way that warranted examination. She set the food on the sawbuck and went back to her own work without making an occasion of it, and he thanked her briefly and ate and went back to work, and this exchange happened every day for the first week and a half without either of them attaching any significance to it. On the 11th day it rained. It was a real spring rain, not a light shower but the heavy persistent kind that arrives in Kansas like it intends to stay. Hazel was in the house making bread when she heard a knock at the door, which surprised her because Arthur Barlow had not once in 11 days knocked at her door for anything. She opened it to find him standing on the porch, hat in hand, rain dripping from his coat. He looked faintly embarrassed, which she had not previously seen on him and which was oddly affecting. "The shed roof is leaking," he said. "Not a complaint, just a fact. I can fix it when the rain lets up." "Come in," she said, because there was nothing else a person could reasonably say. He came in and stood on the braided rug by the door, and looked around the kitchen with the polite attentiveness of a person who knows they are in someone else's private world. The kitchen smelled of bread dough and wood smoke, and the bunches of dried lavender she kept hanging from the ceiling beam because Thomas had hated them, and she had been allowed to put them up only after he was gone, which was something she only rarely thought about now. "Sit down," she said, and he sat at the kitchen table and she poured coffee and set bread and butter on the table because the bread was almost done, and there was no point in pretending she hadn't made it. They sat in the kitchen with the rain falling outside, and she thought she would have to carry the conversation, but she didn't. He talked, not excessively but adequately, about the work, about the problems he had solved so far and the ones still coming. He talked about the second set of rafters and the way he had adjusted the angle by half a degree from her original plans because the prevailing wind on this property came from a slightly different direction than she had accounted for, and this would help the roof shed water more efficiently. "You changed my plans," she said. "Half a degree," he said. "The barn will stand straighter for it." She looked at him across the table. She was not a woman who was easily corrected, but she was also not a woman who valued her own opinion over what was actually true. "How did you determine the wind direction?" she asked. He explained with some specificity how he had spent 3 evenings watching the way the grass moved at the site, and how the smoke from her chimney fell, and how the existing equipment shed had worn on its weather side. It was a thorough answer. It was also a correct one, she realized, because she knew this land and she had simply not thought carefully enough about wind when she drew the plans. "All right," she said. "You're not pleased," he said. "I'm thoughtful," she corrected. "There's a difference." The edge of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile, more the possibility of one. "I can see that," he said. The rain continued for 2 days. He slept in the house, on the settee in the front room, because the shed was genuinely uninhabitable in a real rain, and she was not a person who sent a man to sleep in standing water out of some need to maintain a certain social arrangement. She told herself this firmly. He was an employee and it was practical, and that was all it was. On the second day of rain she found him in the front room in the evening, sitting by the lamp with a book he had taken from her shelf, which was a thing she had not expected and which required her to revise her understanding of him slightly. The book was an account of the Lewis and Clark expedition, which Thomas had bought for reasons she had never been clear on and which she had never read. "Have you read this?" he asked when she came in. "No," she said. She sat in the chair by the fire that had always been her chair. "It's good," he said. "The writing is plain, but the country it describes is extraordinary." He looked at the page. "They were scared constantly. That's what strikes me. Everyone presents it as this great triumph, but the men in the journals are scared most of the time and making it up as they go." "Most good things are made up as you go," she said, which came out more honest than she had intended. He looked at her over the book. He had a way of looking at her that was unhurried and did not demand anything, and she found that she did not entirely dislike it. "Your husband built this house?" he asked. "He did," she said. "It's well built," he said, and there was no flattery in it, just an honest assessment, and she appreciated that more than she would have appreciated any kind of careful compliment. "He was good with wood," she said. "Most things." She paused. "Not all things." He did not press her. He went back to the book. The fire settled and she sat with her mending, and the rain fell outside, and it was, she thought later, one of the more comfortable evenings she had spent in 2 years, which unsettled her a little and which she decided not to think about too carefully. The rain stopped the following morning. Arthur Barlow went back to the shed, which he fixed within an hour, and then back to the barn, and things returned to their previous arrangement, except that something had shifted by a degree so small as to be nearly undetectable. Nearly. She found herself listening for the sound of his hammer in the mornings. She noted when it stopped and what that might indicate. She began bringing better food at midday, not because she had decided to, but because she found herself in the process of doing it before she had consciously made the choice. Corn bread instead of plain biscuits. Cold chicken instead of just bread and butter. She told herself this was what you did when someone was working hard and well, and that was true, but it was not the complete truth. He ate everything she brought without comment except to say it was good, which was the correct thing to say because it was. At the end of the second week, she came out to the site in the late afternoon and found him standing back from the frame with his arms crossed, looking at the emerging structure with the critical eye of someone evaluating their own work. The frame was almost complete, and it was beautiful in the plain, functional way of things made correctly. The lines were true. The joints were tight. She had been watching it rise all week, and she knew enough about construction to understand that what he was building was substantially better than anything she had had before. "It's going to hold," she said, coming to stand beside him. "It's going to hold for 50 years if the wood is maintained," he said. He glanced at her sideways. "You'll need to reseal the lower boards every 3 years. The ground moisture comes up." "I know how to maintain a barn," she said mildly. "I know you do," he said, and there was something in the way he said it, not deference and not flattery but actual acknowledgement, that landed somewhere she did not expect. They stood in the late afternoon light looking at the frame. The sun was going down west of the property, painting the sky in the unreasonable colors that the Kansas prairie specialized in, deep orange fading to pink along the horizon with the blue coming in hard above. "Where did you come from before Colorado?" she asked. She had not asked him much about himself. She had not wanted to invite reciprocity. "Missouri originally," he said. "Then I was in Texas for a few years, worked the Kishom Trail twice, did some work in the New Mexico territory." He paused. "I've been moving for about 10 years. "What are you looking for?" she asked. She had not intended to ask that. He was quiet for a moment, not an evasive quiet but a considering one. "I don't know if I'm looking for anything," he said. "I think I might be looking for a place I want to stop." She said nothing to that. There was nothing to say that wasn't more than she was ready to say. She went back to the house and made supper, and did not think about it with any great deliberateness, which was itself a kind of thinking about it. She had a visitor the following day in the form of her neighbor Clem Hatcher's wife, Loretta, who arrived in the afternoon with a pie and the kind of bright, interested eyes that indicated she had more than pie on her mind. Hazel knew Loretta Hatcher was a fundamentally good woman with an excessive interest in other people's business that she could not fully help, and she received her in the kitchen with good manners and the pie and coffee. "I see you've got a man working out there," Loretta said, approximately 40 seconds into the visit. "A carpenter," Hazel said, "building the barn." "He's been here 2 weeks already," Loretta said, in the tone of someone conveying information they assume is new. "He has," Hazel agreed. "He's building a barn. They take time to build." "He's staying on the property?" Loretta asked. "In the equipment shed," Hazel said. "It's practical." "Of course," Loretta said in a way that meant the opposite. She cut a piece of pie with an expression of determined casualness. "He's not from around here." "No," Hazel said. "He's from Missouri originally. Married." Hazel looked at her. "I hired him to build a barn, Loretta, not to provide a personal history." Loretta had the grace to look slightly abashed. "I only ask because people will talk," she said. "You know how it is. A widow and a strange man on the property. People in Caldwell have been talking about me since Thomas died," Hazel said, with the kind of patience that has been sharpened to a fine point. "They talked when I didn't sell the property. They talked when I went to market alone. They talked when the barn burned and when it fell and when the tornado took it. I have found that the talking does not change anything material about my situation, and so I have stopped concerning myself with it." Loretta blinked. Then she smiled, the real smile she kept behind the social one. "You're a hard woman, Hazel." "I'm a practical one," Hazel said. "There's a difference." After Loretta left, Hazel sat at the table with the remains of the pie and thought about what Loretta had not directly said but had meant, which was the question of Arthur Barlow in a different and more personal sense. She was honest with herself by habit, and so she was honest about this too. She had noticed him, not just as a worker but as a person, the particulars of him, the way he thought carefully before he spoke, the way he was with the horses, easy and straightforward without sentimentality, the fact that he read, the fact that he did not try to be more than what he was. The fact that he had not, in 2 weeks, made a single comment about her managing alone, had not offered unsolicited advice about what she should do with the property or her life or her grief. She had met very few men who could manage that. She put the rest of the pie away and went to check the horses and told herself that she was not going to do anything foolish. The barn roof went on in the 3rd week, and the day they finished the framing, Arthur came to the kitchen door in the evening and knocked, which he had not done since the rain. She opened the door. "Frame's complete," he said. "The roof boards go on tomorrow and then we're into the finishing work. Should be done by the end of the week." She had known this was coming and had thought she was prepared for it. She found that she was less prepared than she had believed. "Good," she said. He looked at her for a moment in the evening light. There was something in his expression that she had started to be able to read, a particular quality of his attention when it was directed at her that was different from the attention he gave to the barn or to a problem he was working out. It was not presumptuous. It was something more careful than that. "Come look at it," he said, "before the light goes." She came out onto the porch and they walked together to the site, which she had been doing every day but always before he was still working. And this was different, just the two of them in the cooling evening with the frame rising above them dark against the deepening sky. It was magnificent, in the plain, honest way of something built right. The proportions were correct. The timber was seasoned and true. She could see from the ground that the joints were tight, and the bracing was set at exactly the angle that would make the whole structure resistant to the particular violence that Kansas weather specialized in. "It's good," she said, and meant it in the full way. "It is," he said, and there was something in his voice that was not just pride in workmanship. Something else that she did not immediately look at directly. They stood in the dusk with the barn frame above them, and the stars beginning to come out, and she was aware of him beside her in a way that was specific and unmistakable, the particular awareness of one person for another that does not involve any analysis but simply is. She had not felt it in a long time. She was not sure she had ever felt it in quite this way, which was unsettling in a manner that was not entirely unpleasant. "Arthur," she said, and then stopped, because she had not decided what came after. "I know," he said. Looked at him. "What do you know?" He looked at her with the directness she had come to trust. "I know that whatever this is, I'm not imagining it, and I know you're not a woman who does anything she hasn't decided to do." He paused. "I'm not asking for anything, I just want you to know I'm not imagining it." She stood with this for a moment. The crickets had started in the grass. "I'm not a simple proposition," she said. "I have this land and I intend to keep it. I have my own way of doing things. I've been alone long enough to know I prefer my own company to bad company. I've worked for you for 3 weeks," he said. "I've noticed all of those things. And I like all of them," he said simply. She looked at him for a long moment. She was 33 years old and she had been married and widowed and she had rebuilt her barn 3 times by then, and she knew the difference between a feeling that would be regretted and one that would not. She was not entirely certain which kind this was, but she was certain that he was not a man she needed to be afraid of in any of the ways that mattered. "You'll finish the barn," she said, "and then we'll see." He nodded, as if this were a perfectly reasonable and complete answer, which it was. They walked back to the house in the dark, and she went in and he went to the shed, and the night settled over the property with a warmth that was not entirely the weather. The barn was finished on a Friday. He walked her through it the way a craftsman shows completed work, noting every feature, explaining every choice. The hayloft was accessible by a ladder set at the right angle for actual use rather than just aesthetics. The stall dividers were set in the ground and pinned at the top beam so they could be removed for larger livestock if needed. The ventilation gaps at the roof peak were sized to the Kansas climate. The main door was hung on a new mechanism he had developed himself, a counterweighted roller that a woman could open with one hand regardless of the wind pressure outside. "You designed that yourself?" she asked. "I've been thinking about it for a while," he said. "The standard hanging door is heavy and it fights you. This one moves with you." She tested it, pulling the door open with 2 fingers. It swung smoothly, effortlessly, and stopped exactly where it should. She pushed it closed and it seated with a satisfying solidity. "That's very clever," she said. He looked pleased in a contained way that she found genuinely endearing, which was the first time she had thought of him in a word like that, and she let herself notice it. "I want to show you one more thing," he said, and led her around to the south wall. At the base of one of the corner posts, in a place that would not be visible once the horses were stabled but was accessible if you knew where to look, he had carved something into the wood. She crouched down to see it. It was her name, Hazel Townsend, 1884. She was quiet for a moment. "Barns with names in them stand longer," he said. "That's not a fact, it's more of a theory." She stood up. She looked at him, and she was not a woman who cried easily or often, but there was a pressure behind her eyes that she acknowledged honestly to herself. "Thank you," she said, and it was for more than the name. She paid him his full wages at the end of that day, and he took them without protest and folded the bills carefully and put them in his coat. Then he stood by his horse in the yard in the afternoon sun, and she stood on the porch steps, and they were both in the specific difficulty of a moment that neither of them entirely knew how to navigate. "I don't have the next job lined up," he said. "I thought I'd stay in Caldwell a while. There's work to be found." "There usually is," she said. "I wondered," he said, "if you might have dinner with me, in town, Saturday." She had not been taken to dinner by a man since Thomas, and even Thomas had not done it frequently. The idea produced in her a complicated mixture of things: pleasure and nervousness, and the specific self-consciousness of a woman who has been defined by her widowhood in a small town, and knows that dinner with a man will produce fresh conversation in certain quarters. She held all of this in her mind for a moment and then set most of it aside. "Saturday," she said. "Yes." His expression did the thing she had started to watch for, the not-quite smile that was more personal than a smile because it was not performed. "6 o'clock," he said. "I'll come here." He rode Clement down the road, and she watched him go and then went inside and stood in the kitchen for a long moment, looking at nothing in particular, aware of something she had not felt in a considerable time and unsure whether it was happiness or the anticipation of it, and deciding that the distinction was not currently important. Saturday came with the particular quality of spring days in Kansas that feel like an apology for all the difficult ones. Clear and warm with a wind that smelled of grass rather than dust. Hazel wore the blue dress she had made the previous winter, which was practical but well-fitted, and a color that she knew from the mirror was good on her. She did her hair with more care than usual and was briefly annoyed at herself for caring, and then decided that it was acceptable to care about how you looked when someone was coming to dinner, and that the annoyance was unnecessary. Arthur arrived at 6 exactly, which told her something about him. He had cleaned up considerably, his hair combed, wearing a white shirt and dark trousers and his good coat, and she saw him taking in the blue dress in the way that men do when they are trying not to be obvious about it and are not entirely succeeding. "You look very nice," he said. "You look cleaned up," she said, which was meant to be a compliment and which he received as one. They rode into Caldwell in his wagon, which he had borrowed from the stable where he was keeping Clement, and she sat beside him on the bench with the evening coming in around them, and the town lights beginning to show ahead. She was aware of several people watching them arrive, which she had anticipated, and which she found she minded less than she had expected. Loretta Hatcher's face in the window of the dry goods store as they passed was almost satisfying. The restaurant in Caldwell was a place called Mama Sutter's, run by a German woman named Clara Sutter, who had come west with her husband in 1875 and buried him in 1878, and had made an excellent business in the years since. Clara Sutter greeted Hazel with the particular warmth of one resourceful widow for another, and showed them to a corner table with a window, which Hazel suspected was Clara's small contribution to a romance she had decided was appropriate. They had roast beef and potatoes and bread that Clara made herself, and 2 glasses of wine each, which was more wine than Hazel had drunk in a single evening in some time. They talked. She had not expected how easy it would be to talk to him, not because she was not articulate, but because she had forgotten how it felt to talk to someone who listened with genuine attention rather than the half-attention of someone waiting for their own turn. He told her about the cattle drives, the particular loneliness of them, and the strange beauty of moving thousands of animals across open country by sheer collective will. He told her about the church he had built in Laramie, the one that was still standing, and how the congregation had come out to lay the foundation stones with him because they wanted to be part of it, how an elderly woman named Mrs. Pearl had carried stones in her apron. He told her about the mine collapse in Colorado with the directness of someone who has made peace with something frightening, without pretending it wasn't frightening. She told him things she had not told anyone in a long time. She told him about coming to Kansas as a young woman of 19, coming from Ohio with Thomas and his family, arriving on land that was nothing like the green of Ohio, and learning to love it anyway because it was hers. She told him about the specific difficulties of the first few years, the grasshopper plague of 1874 that had eaten everything, the way the community had come together, and the way it had afterward pretended certain divisions had not existed. She told him about Thomas, honestly about the kind of marriage it had been, good in many ways and limited in others, and she did not dress it up. He listened to all of it without trying to fix any of it or offer perspective she hadn't asked for. "What do you want?" he asked her near the end of the evening. "Not what you need or what's practical. What do you want?" She considered it. "I want the land," she said. "I've always wanted the land. I want to make something of it that will still be making something in 20 years. She looked at the candle flame for a moment. "I want company," she said. "The right kind." "I didn't know that was something I wanted until fairly recently." He looked at her across the table. "What's the right kind?" "Someone who doesn't try to manage me," she said. "Someone I can trust with things that are mine." Someone who she stopped, because the next thing was more than she had planned to say. "Someone who sees you," he said. She looked at him. "Yes," she said. "That." They drove back in the dark with the stars tremendous overhead and the horse knowing the way without guidance. Somewhere before her property line, without any of the negotiation that precedes such things in the self-conscious, she leaned into his shoulder, and he put his arm around her on the bench, and they drove the last half-mile to her gate in that arrangement, which was not a small thing for either of them. At the gate he helped her down from the wagon and they stood in the lane, and he looked at her in the dark with the expression that she had spent 3 weeks learning and found she still could not fully read, which she thought was probably the point. "I'd like to call on you," he said, "properly, if you're agreeable." "I'm agreeable," she said. He rode back to town, and she walked up the lane to the house, and Soot met her on the porch, and she scratched the dog's ears, and stood looking at the barn for a long moment in the dark, her barn, solid and true and right, and felt something she had almost forgotten was available to her. He called on her the following Tuesday and the one after that, and on the third call he arrived with a bag of seed he had heard she needed, and which she had not mentioned to him, but which Pete Sorensen had apparently mentioned in passing, and she let the seed come without comment because it was practical, and because the thought behind it was not something she wanted to argue with. The courtship, if that was what it was, moved at a pace that was neither rushed nor cautious, but something more organic than either, shaped by who they both were, and by the fact that they were both people who had been through enough to know that urgency was not the same as feeling. He came to the property some days to help with things that needed doing, not assuming but offering, and she accepted or declined based on what was actually needed, and not on any principle she was trying to demonstrate. One afternoon in June, he was helping her repair a section of fence on the east side of the property, and she was working beside him rather than directing him, which was how it went when they worked together, each doing what they could do. The sun was high and it was hot, and she had her sleeves rolled to the elbow because there was no point in anything else, and she saw him look at her once in the middle of a task, briefly, the way you look at something when you think you might not be looking enough. She looked back. "Arthur," she said. "Yes," he said, setting the fence post straight. "I think you should stop living at that boarding house," she said. He was quiet for a moment, holding the post. "What are you suggesting?" he asked carefully. She looked at the fence line and then at him. "I'm suggesting you're paying rent when you could be building something instead," she said. "The equipment shed could be made into decent quarters. You've already got the skills." He looked at her for a long moment. "That's a significant thing to offer a man," he said. "It's practical," she said. "You could keep working in the area. You don't need to pay rent. The shed isn't being used for anything essential." "Hazel," he said, with a quality in his voice that meant he was being serious. "Are you telling me you want me to stay?" She met his eyes. She was not a woman who said things she did not mean or who hid in practicality when the real thing was available. "Yes," she said. "That's what I'm telling you." He nodded once slowly, the way he did when he had arrived at a conclusion that satisfied him. "All right," he said. "I'll give notice at the boarding house on Friday." He moved into the shed at the end of June, having spent 2 evenings making it livable, a real floor, a window with a shutter, a proper door. It was small but adequate, and it was on her property, and this was the arrangement they had decided on, and she found that she slept better knowing he was there, which was a fact she acknowledged to herself without embarrassment. The summer moved with the particular richness of a summer that has good things in it. He took on construction work in town and the surrounding properties, and built a reputation in Caldwell as someone who did what he said he would do and did it right, which was all the reputation that mattered. She managed the farm with the efficiency she had always managed it, and the cattle numbers were back up to 8 by August, and the garden was producing abundantly. There was a quality to the days that she had not had before, a substance, a texture, as if life had added a dimension she had not fully realized was missing. He ate supper with her most evenings. This had developed naturally, and they had not formalized it, but it was the pattern, and she had begun to cook in the larger quantities that cooking for two required without consciously deciding to. They talked over supper the way people do when they are comfortable together, about the day's work, about the news that came in from Wichita by newspaper, about the neighbors, about things they were reading. He had finished the Lewis and Clark account, and had moved on to a volume of natural history that he had bought at the general store. She was reading a collection of letters from a woman who had homesteaded in Nebraska in the 1860s, and they exchanged observations from their respective books in the way of people who have found in each other an audience for the things they notice. On a warm August evening, they sat on the porch after supper, which had also become the pattern, and the air smelled of the cut hay that her neighbor's boys had done that week, and the particular fullness of midsummer, and she was aware, sitting there with him in the settling dark, that she was happy in a way that was not about any particular circumstance, but about the fact of his presence, which was something she wanted to look at honestly. "Arthur," she said, he said, which was his supper porch sound, relaxed and attentive at once. "I want to tell you something," she said. He turned to look at her. "I was afraid of this," she said. "Not you specifically, but this, what it would mean to want someone again. I had decided I was done with that kind of wanting, not out of grief, but I think I had decided it was too much risk." He was quiet, listening. "I want you to know that I'm not afraid of it now," she said. "In case that matters to you." He was quiet for a long moment, long enough that she had time to notice the sound of the insects in the grass and the owl that had taken up residence in the new barn. Then he reached across the space between their chairs and took her hand, which he had not done before, not quite like this, with the deliberateness of something chosen. "It matters to me," he said. She looked at their hands. His was large and calloused from the work, and she thought of all the things those hands had built, and she thought of her name carved at the base of the corner post, Hazel Townsend, 1884, and she turned his hand over and held it properly. They stayed on the porch until it was full dark. The following morning she found a small problem. A section of the barn floor nearest the east wall had developed a soft spot, which was not a structural issue, but was a maintenance one that she had noticed the previous week and mentioned to him over supper. When she went out after breakfast, she found him already there, already on his knees examining the boards, before she had said anything that morning, before she had even indicated she was going to address it. She stood in the barn doorway and watched him work and felt something she did not have an immediate word for, which was the quality of being genuinely known, of having someone pay attention to your actual life, and not to a version of it they were comfortable with. Thomas had loved her in the way of people who love a place, comprehensively but without always seeing the particulars. Arthur Barlow paid attention to the particulars. "It's the ground moisture coming up under the board joint," he said without looking up. "I should have added a second moisture barrier when I built it. I'll fix it today." "You mentioned that possibility when you built it," she said. "I should have fixed it then," he said, and there was a firmness in it that was about his own standards rather than about apology. He fixed it that day, replacing the boards and adding the layer he should have included the first time. And when he was done, she brought him water and they sat together on the barn floor in the afternoon. And she thought that this was perhaps the most ordinary and the most complete afternoon she had had in a very long time. Autumn came in September with the gold and brown that Kansas did better than anywhere she had ever been, the grass going tawny, and the sky deepening to a blue that was more serious than the summer blue. She brought in the last of the garden, preserving everything that could be preserved, and he helped with the cattle preparation for winter, building a small windbreak for the herd's winter pasture that was not elaborate but was exactly right for its purpose. It was in October, on a Sunday afternoon when the light was the low amber of late autumn, that he proposed to her. She had not entirely expected it to happen on that particular Sunday, though she had known it was coming. They had been together enough months that the question was present between them without needing to be acknowledged, and she had spent some time considering what her answer would be, not whether but how, because the how of it mattered to her. He had been helping her split the last of the winter wood, and they had stopped for water and were standing by the woodpile in the autumn sun, and he set down his cup and turned to look at her with the deliberateness that meant something important was coming. "Hazel," he said. "Arthur," she said. "I want to ask you something," he said, "and I want to say it plainly because I think you appreciate plain speaking." "I do," she said. "I love you," he said. "I want you to know that isn't a thing I'm using to get to the question. It's the reason for the question. I love the particular way you are, the way you think and the way you work and the way you're honest about everything even when it would be easier not to be. I love this land and what you've made of it. I would like to be a part of both of those things if you'll have me." He paused. "I'm asking you to marry me." She looked at him in the autumn light. She had given herself over entirely to honesty in the past months, not sentimentality but honesty, and the honest thing was that she had been waiting for this moment with more hope than she had allowed herself to fully feel until it arrived. "I love you," she said. "I realized it in June and I've been sitting with it ever since, which I think you probably knew." He started to smile. "Yes," she said. "I'll marry you." He crossed the space between them and kissed her, which was the first time they had kissed, and which had in it everything that had been building between them since a Wednesday morning in April, when a woman had rolled out her plans on the back of a lumber pile, and a man had asked the right questions and not asked the wrong ones. They married in November in the small church in Caldwell, in a ceremony that was not large but was attended by the people who mattered. Clara Sutter from the restaurant was there. Clem and Loretta Hatcher came, and Loretta cried in a way that somehow managed to be about herself and also genuinely affecting. Pete Sorensen had come in from a job in the territory specifically for the occasion, which touched her unexpectedly, and he shook Arthur's hand with the particular sincerity of men who do not express feeling easily and mean it all the more when they do. Reverend Doyle performed the ceremony with notable relief, as if he had been expecting the burden of her solitary situation to become the community's at any moment, and was grateful it had resolved in a conventional direction. She would have been annoyed by this except that she was too pleased about other things to accommodate the annoyance. They rode home in the evening to the property that was now theirs together, which was a word she had not used in the 2-year plural since Thomas, and she thought as they came up the lane that the barn looked exactly right in the November dusk, solid and dark against the sky, and she knew what was under the corner post, and it was her name, and it was enough. The winter was the first winter she had not been alone since Thomas, and it was different from those winters in every particular. The house was different with 2 people in it, warmer in the obvious way and in other ways that had to do with sound, with the small background evidence of another life being lived in the same space. He was not loud, but he was present, and she had not realized how loud absence was until it was no longer the prevailing sound. He took on a significant project in the spring of 1885, a construction contract for a new general store in Caldwell that was the largest job he had yet had in the area, and she managed the farm through the spring planting, with the addition of a boy named Franklin from town who came 3 days a week to help with the heavy work. The operation of the property had grown substantially since Arthur arrived. The cattle herd was 10 now. She had added chickens in a proper coop he had built in the fall. The vegetable garden had expanded to include a longer growing area along the south fence. By early summer she knew she was expecting a child. She told Arthur on a Sunday morning before church, sitting at the kitchen table with coffee, and she told him directly because she was not a woman who dramatized announcements, and she watched his face go through a series of things that ended in an expression she had not specifically seen on him before, which was the expression of a man for whom something has become real that was previously only imagined. He took both her hands across the table. "Are you well?" he said. "How do you feel?" "I feel fine," she said. "I feel entirely well. I'm not made of glass, Arthur." "I know," he said. "You're made of something considerably harder." He looked at her with the full weight of his attention. "I'm very glad," he said. "So am I," she said, and meant it completely. The pregnancy progressed through the summer into the autumn without the dramatic difficulty that some women experienced, which she attributed to the fact that she continued to work and eat properly and did not take to bed on principle. Arthur hovered in a way that she found more endearing than irritating, which said something about him, because she had a very low tolerance for hovering in general. He built things. The baby prompted him to build. A crib from good maple with carved rail details that were simple and precise, a small chest for clothes, a rocking chair for the bedroom that was the most comfortable chair in the house. Her son was born in February of 1886, delivered by the midwife Mrs. Crane from town on a cold, clear night, while Arthur sat in the kitchen and made unnecessary amounts of coffee, and was spoken to gently by Mrs. Crane's assistant on 2 occasions when he attempted to be helpful in ways that were not actually helpful. The baby was healthy and substantial, and arrived with an opinion about the proceedings that he expressed at length. Arthur held his son for the first time with the careful completeness of a man who is holding something he does not want to damage, sitting beside her bed in the early morning light, and she watched his face and thought that she had never seen him so simultaneously large and careful. "What shall we call him?" she asked. They had discussed names and had arrived at Thomas Arthur Barlow as the first choice, Thomas for her first husband, which was a complication Arthur had offered to navigate without pressure, and she had accepted in the spirit in which it was offered, as a recognition that her history was not a problem to be solved. "Thomas Arthur," she said, "if you're still agreeable." "Thomas Arthur," he said, looking at the baby, who was dark-haired and had Arthur's nose already, which she found amusing. "Yes, Thomas Arthur Barlow." Thomas Arthur Barlow was called Tommy, and he was a serious baby who became a serious toddler, which seemed genetic given both of his parents, but also a curious and warm one who investigated everything within reach with a thoroughness that Arthur found clearly gratifying. The farm continued to grow. Arthur had established himself securely in Caldwell as the best construction man in the county, and had more work than he could manage alone. In the spring of 1887, he hired his first helper, a young man named James Whitcomb who was 19 and willing and good at taking instruction, and the business grew from there. Hazel had expanded the egg operation to the point where she was supplying 3 establishments in town in addition to the Saturday market, and she was managing the accounts with a precision that she found satisfying in a way that the purely physical work of the farm, while she loved it, did not quite match. Numbers told a story about effort and result that pleased her logician's mind. She was in the barn one morning in the spring of 1887, doing the morning check that she did every day, moving through the stalls with the ease of someone who knows a place in every particular. She ran her hand along the main beam. The wood was good, the grain tight, the surface smooth. She found the corner post near the east wall and crouched down, and there was her name in the wood, Hazel Townsend, 1884. Not Hazel Barlow, because it had been 1884 and she had been Hazel Townsend, and it still said what it said, and it was still true. She stood up and heard the crunch of boots on the floor behind her and turned to find Arthur in the barn doorway, Tommy on his hip, both of them looking at her with the same particular expression of uncomplicated affection that was, she had concluded, the best available expression on any face. "Breakfast is ready," he said. "I'll be right in," she said, and meant it and went. In the summer of 1887, a complication arrived in the form of a man named Douglas Prager, who owned the property south of hers, and who had been trying to purchase the Townsend land for 3 years, since before Arthur had arrived. Prager was not a bad man exactly, but he was a calculating one, and he had decided that a widow managing 40 acres alone was a situation that would eventually resolve itself in his favor if he was patient enough. The arrival of Arthur Barlow had disrupted this calculation, and he had not entirely accepted the disruption. Prager came to the property on a July afternoon with an offer to buy, which was not unreasonable and which she declined, as she had declined all previous offers, with a directness that left no room for interpretation. "You're leaving money on the table," Prager said. He was addressing Arthur, which was a choice he would not make a second time. "The offer was made to me," Hazel said. "I'll thank you to direct your remarks accordingly." Prager looked at her with the particular irritation of a man who has expected a woman to be more manageable than she is. "The land is not supporting what it could. With my acreage combined, there's a real future here." "There's a real future here as it is," she said. "My answer is no. It's been no for 3 years, and it will continue to be no." Prager looked at Arthur, which was his final miscalculation of the afternoon. Arthur looked back at him with the quiet directness that was his way with problems, not threatening but entirely clear. "Mrs. Barlow has answered you," he said. "I'd consider the matter settled." Prager left. He did not come back with an offer after that, though he was occasionally unneighborly in small ways for another season before he adjusted to the reality of the situation. She appreciated that Arthur had let her answer first and had only spoken when she was done, and that what he had said supported her position without undermining it by being the one to say it. She told him so that evening, and he seemed genuinely pleased by the observation, which was the kind of man he was. The second child arrived in 1889, a girl they named Ruth Eleanor Barlow, who arrived in the spring with considerably more efficiency than Tommy had, and who was, from the beginning, a completely different kind of person. Where Tommy was methodical and observant, Ruth was immediate and loud and charming in the way of people who discover early that charm is useful. She had Hazel's coloring, which was a fact that Arthur found unreasonably delightful. Tommy was 3 when Ruth arrived, and received her with a 3-year-old's mixture of curiosity and proprietorship, that settled into genuine fondness within a few weeks. Hazel watched her children with the specific pleasure of observing people who are themselves rather than what you expected, which she believed was the best thing children could do. The farm in 1889 was a substantially different operation than the 40 acres she had stood on alone in 1882. The cattle herd was 15, managed now with the help of a hired hand named Carlos Rivera, who had come up from Texas and who was the best man with cattle she had ever seen, including Thomas. She had not reduced her own involvement in the operation, but she had allowed it to become something larger than one woman could manage alone, which was not a defeat but a growth. Arthur's construction business had made enough to add a proper equipment building behind the barn, a smoke house, and a second well. On a morning in October of that year, she stood in the yard in the early light and looked at the farm in the particular way she sometimes did, when she wanted to see it whole rather than in its daily particulars. The barn rose solid and right against the sky, the weather vane she had replaced after the tornado of the previous year, a simple arrow this time rather than a rooster, turning easily in the morning breeze. The house was unchanged from the outside but transformed within. The equipment buildings, the new well, the kitchen garden that had grown into something that fed not just the household but contributed meaningfully to the winter preserves she sold in town. Arthur came out of the house behind her, carrying 2 cups of coffee, Tommy trailing at his knee with the determined concentration of a 3-year-old following a parent. He came to stand beside her and gave her one of the cups, and they stood together looking at the farm in the morning light. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "I'm thinking about all of it," she said. "What it was, what it is." She sipped the coffee. "I rebuilt the barn 3 times before you came," she said. "Did I ever tell you that?" "You told me twice in the tornado," he said. "Yes. I spent 2 years convinced that I was going to do all of it alone," she said. "Not because I wanted to be alone, but because I had decided the alternative was too costly." He looked at her. "Were you wrong?" She thought about this honestly. "I was wrong about the cost," she said. "I was right about what I needed. I just didn't know what form it would take." He was quiet for a moment. Tommy had found a stick and was occupied with something at the edge of the porch. The morning air was the cool, specific smell of autumn, leaves and turned earth, and the smoke beginning from the kitchen chimney. "I was looking for a place to stop," he said, echoing what he had told her on that first April evening at the barn site. "I'd been moving for 10 years looking for a place that felt like it was worth stopping for. And," she said, he looked at the farm, then at her. "And I found it the first Wednesday I rode up this road," he said. "I just needed you to agree." She laughed, which was a sound that had become easy and frequent in the years they had been together, and he smiled the full smile that she had worked to earn all those months in the spring of 1884. And Tommy looked up from his stick and said something incomprehensible but clearly pleased, because his parents were pleased. The years built on each other with the comfortable weight of real life, which does not lack difficulty, but carries it differently when you are carrying it with someone. In 1891 they lost a calf to disease that spread through the herd before Carlos caught it, and the containment cost them 2 adult cattle and a difficult winter of careful rationing. In 1892, there was a drought that made the kitchen garden a daily battle and reduced the hay by 1/3. These things happened, and they handled them together, which did not make the problems easier, but made the aftermath of them livable in a way that she had found very difficult to achieve alone. Tommy started school in the fall of 1892, walking the 1.5 miles to the schoolhouse in town with the lunch pail she packed him, and the particular gravity of a boy who takes things seriously. His teacher, a woman named Miss Aldrich who was fresh from Ohio and slightly overwhelmed by frontier children, sent home a note after the first month saying that Thomas Arthur Barlow was the most careful reader in the class, which made Hazel quietly happy in a way she did not entirely show, because she did not want Tommy to think that careful reading was what she needed from him rather than his own self. Arthur read the note and said, He gets that from you, and she said, he gets it from both of us. And that was the end of that conversation. Ruth began school 2 years later and was a completely different kind of student, easily bored by repetition, brilliant at the moments when something genuinely interested her, and prone to resolving arguments with classmates through a combination of logic and stubbornness that Miss Aldrich found exhausting and Hazel found difficult to disapprove of. In the spring of 1894, Arthur came to her with a proposal that was not about marriage this time, but about land. He had heard that the property to the north, a 60-acre parcel that had been owned by a family named Garrett who had given up on Kansas and gone back to Ohio, was available for purchase at a reasonable price. The 60 acres had good water and decent grazing and would more than double the operation. She sat at the kitchen table with the numbers spread before her, which she had been doing since before he brought it to her, because she had heard the same thing through a different source. She had already run the calculations. "We can do it," she said. "It stretches us for 2 years. We'd need to hold the herd steady and not add any infrastructure." "I know," he said. "I thought so too." He looked at the numbers. 2 hard years and then we have something worth more than double what we have now. She looked at him. "It's a risk," she said. "So was building your 4th barn," he said. She looked at him for a moment and then looked back at the numbers. "All right," she said. "Let's buy it." They purchased the Garrett property in June of 1894, and the 2 years that followed were as difficult as they had predicted. Not desperate but careful in the specific way of people who have allowed themselves very little margin. She went back to making every economy she had made in the years she was alone, and Arthur took every construction job he was offered and did not spend anything that could be avoided. Tommy, at 9, was old enough to understand in general terms that things were tight and was quietly helpful in the way of children who absorb the atmosphere of their family and respond to it. Ruth, at 5, was less aware and more expensive in small daily ways that Hazel managed with patient creativity. By 1896, the new land was integrated into the operation and paying its way, and the cattle herd had grown to 30 on the combined acreage, which was a size that required real management and which Carlos Rivera handled with a capability she continued to find remarkable. She had promoted Carlos to a formal position, foreman of the cattle operation, and paid him accordingly. He was a fair and decent man who had faced considerable prejudice in his years in Kansas, and she had made it clear from the day he came to work for her that, on the Townsend Barlow property, his work was what mattered, and that was the only measure she cared about. He had stayed for 8 years, and she believed he would stay longer. On an evening in the spring of 1896, she and Arthur sat on the porch in the manner they had maintained through all the years, the end-of-day settling that had become as much a part of the farm's rhythm as the morning feeding. The children were inside. The air was warm and the new grass was up in the north pasture, and she could see, very faintly in the distance, the cattle moving against the green. "I want to tell you something," he said. She looked at him. He was 45 now, which showed in the particular weathering of men who work outside, the lines around his eyes, the gray coming into his hair. He was still the same in the ways that had mattered from the beginning. "When I rode up this road in 1884, he said, "I was not looking for what I found. I want to be clear about that. I was looking for work and I found you, and finding you changed everything about what I wanted, and I need you to know that 12 years later, having found it, I understand that I was lucky in a way that most people never are." She sat with this for a moment. She had never been a woman who needed things said to be sure of them, but there was a particular pleasure in the saying, an acknowledgement that the thing was real and worth naming. "I know," she said. "I feel it too." "I know you know," he said. "I wanted to say it anyway." She reached across and took his hand, which was the gesture of 12 years, the one that had started on an August evening in rocking chairs and had never really stopped. "You're going to make me sentimental," she said. "You were already sentimental," he said. "You keep dried lavender in the kitchen," she laughed. "I keep lavender because I like the smell and because no one can tell me not to." "No argument," he he said, and turned his hand to hold hers properly. They sat until the dark came in from the east, which is where it always came from in Kansas, rolling in across the flat land like something deliberate, and the stars came out above the barn, and the farm settled into its night sounds, and she thought about the whole of it, the span of it, the woman she had been in a nightgown in the dirt watching a barn burn, and the woman she was now, which were the same woman but separated by an enormous distance of lived experience. And she found that she was grateful for all of it, the burning and the rebuilding, and the man who had ridden up the road in the spring. Tommy was 15 and Ruth was 11 when the century turned, and the new century arrived in Caldwell with more ceremony than the previous one had demanded, and the whole family went to the church celebration, and Tommy stood very straight in his good coat, and Ruth wore a blue dress that was the same color as the one her mother had worn to dinner at Clara Sutter's in 1884, though she did not know that. She and Arthur danced at the celebration, which was something they did rarely and she enjoyed thoroughly. He was not a graceful dancer, but he was an enthusiastic one, which she found more charming than grace. And Clara Sutter danced with Pete Sorensen, who came through Caldwell every year or two, and who was aging gracefully and still had the same directness she had always appreciated. On the way home in the wagon with the children sleeping in the back, she leaned against Arthur on the bench in the exact way she had leaned against him on the first night he had driven her home from dinner, and thought that it was remarkable how certain things complete a circle. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "Circles," she said. "Good ones or the kind that come back on you?" "Good ones," she said. "The kind that hold." He put his arm around her, and they drove home through the new century with the stars overhead and the children sleeping behind them and the farm waiting at the end of the road, the barn visible long before the house because it was the tallest thing on the flat horizon, which was exactly as she had planned it. The years from 1900 to 1905 had the quality of something well made that is being used properly. There was wear and maintenance and the occasional failure, but the essential structure was sound and showed it. Tommy finished school in 1901 and went to work with Arthur full-time, and he had the family talent for building, which was to say that he had patience and attention to detail, and the willingness to do things over when the first result was not right. She watched her son work with his father and felt something that was not simple pride, but something closer to the satisfaction of things fitting correctly together. Ruth remained Ruth, which meant that she was 17 in 1906 and deeply involved in everything and certain about her own judgments in a way that Hazel recognized from looking in mirrors, and which she chose to address with patience rather than authority, because she understood where it came from, and because Ruth was mostly right, which made authority a complicated tool. Ruth's courtship by a young man named Henry Marsh in the summer of 1906 produced a winter of discussion in the Barlow household that was equal parts genuine engagement and the management of strong-willed personalities. Henry Marsh was 20 and a school teacher, and had the sort of earnest solidity that Hazel thought would serve him well with her daughter, who needed in a partner the same things she had needed herself. Someone who would not try to manage her, who would pay attention to her actual self rather than a version of her they found more convenient. She discussed this with Arthur one evening while Ruth was out with Henry and Tommy was in town at the social hall. Arthur listened and nodded and said, "She knows herself. She'll choose right." "I know she knows herself," Hazel said. "I'm not worried she'll choose wrong. I'm working out how to tell her what I know about making it last." He looked at her. "What do you know about it?" she considered. "That the real thing is not the feeling, though the feeling matters. The real thing is the attention, whether you see each other clearly and keep doing it, whether you choose each other in the ordinary days when there's nothing romantic about it, when someone has to fix the barn floor or manage the accounts or sit with something difficult." She paused. "I didn't know that at 19. I might have guessed some of it by 30, but I didn't know it until you." He looked at her for a long moment with the expression that was still, after 22 years, capable of being specific and present and not at all habitual. "Tell her that," he said. "Tell her exactly that." She did tell Ruth, and Ruth listened with the focused attention she kept for things that genuinely mattered to her, and then said, "Is that what you and Papa have? That kind of attention?" "Yes," Hazel said, "that's what we have." Ruth married Henry Marsh in the spring of 1908 in the same church in Caldwell, where Hazel and Arthur had married. And the community that had gathered to watch Hazel Townsend manage alone had long since accommodated itself to the fact of the Barlows as one of the fixed and substantial things of the county. The people you called when something needed to be built, and the woman you trusted with accounts, and the family that had turned 40 acres and a burned barn into something worth twice the land and 3 times the life. Tommy married his own bride in 1909, a woman named Catherine Park who had come to Kansas from Pennsylvania and who had a dry wit and an excellent practical mind that Hazel liked immediately and completely. Catherine came to the farm often and learned the egg accounts without being asked, and brought her own contribution to the operation in the form of an expertise in cheese making that added a new product line to the Saturday market. Arthur built Tommy and Catherine a house on the northeast corner of the expanded property, which was the right place for it, on the land but with its own threshold. By 1910, when Hazel was 61 and Arthur was 63, the Barlow property was something that the county talked about not as the widow's farm but as the Barlow operation, which was larger and more diverse and more soundly managed than most of what surrounded it. The herd had grown and stabilized. The construction business that Arthur had started in 1884 was now managed primarily by Tommy, who had added 2 more skilled men and had enough work to keep all of them busy through every season. On a morning in the spring of 1910, Hazel walked out to the barn before breakfast, as she had done every morning for 28 years. The air was the particular quality of early spring, cold in the shade and warm in the sun, with the smell of the turned earth from the garden that Carlos's son Miguel was preparing, because Carlos had retired the previous autumn and his son had come naturally to the work. She put her hand on the barn wall at the east corner and stood in the morning light. The wood was in good condition, resealed and maintained as Arthur had specified it should be, and it was going to stand for another 50 years, which was what he had said, and she believed him. She crouched down at the corner post and ran her fingers over the carved letters she had not needed to look at for years because she knew exactly where they were. Hazel Townsend, 1884. The name she had been when she stood in her nightgown in the dirt watching a barn burn and decided with the flat practical certainty that was her nature that she would rebuild. She had rebuilt 4 times. The 4th time she had walked out of the house, and the man who would become her husband was already holding the first beam, and her life had divided cleanly at that point into what was before and what was after, not in the way of tragedy but in the way of grace, which is the more interesting kind of division. She stood up and brushed the dirt from her knees and looked at the barn in the morning light, and she heard his boots on the packed earth behind her before she saw him, the particular sound of his step that she had been hearing for 26 years, and she turned to find him there with 2 cups of coffee and the specific unhurried expression of a man who has found where he wanted to stop and has not regretted it for a single morning since. "You're up early," he said. "I'm always up early," she said, taking the coffee. "That's true," he said. He looked at the barn, holding up well. "Better than well," she said. "It'll outlast us both." He came to stand beside her, which was where he had been standing in one sense or another for 26 years, and they looked at the barn together in the spring morning with the property spreading out around them and the sound of the new day coming in across the grass. "I want to ask you something," she said. "All right," he said. "If you could go back to that Wednesday morning in April," she said, "knowing what it would all cost and take and require. Knowing the hard years and the worrying and the 2 years when we stretched thin and the times things didn't work, would you still ride up this road?" He did not take even a moment to think about it. "Yes," he said. She looked at him. "You didn't consider it." "There was nothing to consider," he said. "I'd ride up this road every time." She looked at the barn and then at the man beside her and then back at the barn, which held her name in its wood and which had been built by his hands, and which had stood through the years, the way things stand when they are built right on a good foundation by someone who knows what they are doing and takes pride in it. She leaned against his shoulder as she had been leaning against him since a summer evening in 1884, and he put his arm around her as he had been putting his arm around her since the same evening, and they stood in the spring morning with everything they had built around them and the coffee warm in their hands and the day beginning. "Good," she said, "because I'd let you in every time." The barn stood. The farm stood. The life they had made together stood, which was the thing she had always known how to build and had needed only to find the right partner for, and which she had found on a Wednesday in April when she rolled out her plans on the back of a lumber pile, and a man on a bay horse had asked exactly the right questions. Tommy and Catherine had their first child, a boy named Arthur James Barlow, in the fall of 1910, which made Arthur a grandfather and which he responded to with a quietness that was about depth rather than absence. He held his grandson with the same careful completeness with which he had held Tommy 24 years before, and the baby had the same family nose and the same tendency toward gravity, and she looked at the three of them, her husband and her son and her grandson, and felt the particular fullness of a life in which the things you have built are still standing, and the people you love are present in the morning light. Ruth and Henry came for Christmas of that year with their own news, which was that they would be adding to the family in the summer, and the house that had been Thomas Townsend's plain square house was suddenly full in every room with voices, and the particular noise of a life that has compounded itself into abundance. She stood in the kitchen on Christmas evening, the dishes done, the family in the front room with the fire, and she looked at the kitchen she had been cooking in since 1880, the ceiling beam with the bundles of dried lavender that she had been hanging since 1882, and that she intended to keep hanging until she couldn't reach the beam anymore, and she thought about what it meant to survive something and rebuild it, and what it meant to keep rebuilding until what you built finally held. She had rebuilt the barn 3 times in difficulty and loss. The 4th time she had walked out and he was already there, holding the first beam, and the barn had stood for 26 years and intended to stand for 50 more. That was, she thought, the right story. Not the burning and the falling and the losing which were real and which had happened, but the 4th morning and the man who was already there and the choice to build it right. She went into the front room where her family was gathered, and Arthur looked up when she came in, across the room, with the expression that had not changed in 26 years, that particular quality of his attention that was still specific and present and not at all habitual. And she sat beside him on the settee, and his hand found hers in the manner of long practice. And her grandson Arthur James was asleep in Tommy's arms, and Ruth was laughing at something Henry had said, and the fire was warm, and the barn was standing in the winter dark outside, and holding all of it, the name in the wood and the years in the walls, and she was, in the full and specific sense of the word, home.